Okay. Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman, and I run events and marketing with McNally Jackson, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're so glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us, especially if you're in the US. Throughout the evening, I'll be posting links in the chat to buy Homo Irrealis. And I'm so happy to welcome tonight André Aciman, the author of the New York Times bestselling Call Me By Your Name, Out of Egypt, 8 White Nights, False Papers, Alibis, Harvard Square, Enigma Variations, and Find Me. He's the editor of the Proust Project and teaches comparative literature at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He lives with his wife in Manhattan. And joining André tonight is Rachel Donadio. She's a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a former Rome bureau chief and European cultural correspondent of the New York Times. Over the years, she has reported from more than 24 countries and interviewed many heads of state and cultural figures, including 3 Nobel laureates in literature. And she also contributes to the New York Review of Books. Welcome to both of you. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you so much for having us. And I'm really thrilled and honored to talk to André about his beautiful new book of essays. We're pronouncing it Homo Irrealis, I believe. Yes. And I wanted I think that it's a gorgeous book about so many different things, about how we read our own lives through art and how we see ourselves reflected in art and how we're different people in different cities and we imagine the cities in real life and then in our imaginations. But André, I just thought at the outset, I would ask you to tell us a little bit about the title and the concept of the Irealis Mood, which is such a rich grammatical and really emotional and imaginative concept on which you founded this book. So tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. The book started about 10 years ago when I wrote another book in which I used the word once, the Irealis term. And it meant a lot to me because it's a conflation of all those moods. There are about 20 of them. We usually talk about only 4, which is the conditional mood. I would have gone to the movies if you had invited me. The optative, which is, I should go to the movies tonight. I have nothing to do. That's 1 form. And then you have, of course, the imperative, which is go to the movies, or the subjunctive, which does not exist really in English, so it's impossible to say, but it is imperative that I go to the movies, or that it is imperative that he go to the movies. That's the subjunctive. We seldom use that form in English any longer. In other countries, French and Italian, for example, the subjunctive is very frequent, so is the conditional. And people like to use the conditional mood instead of the indicative, which is I am, I was, I will be. Those are definitive in what is called the indicative mood. Whereas the conditional is I might be, I might have been, I could be. And so I've created this one sentence, which is a souffle sentence because it folds on itself all the time. I might have been, or what it goes something, I'm going to read it because the might have been that never happened, but isn't unreal for not happening and might still happen, though we fear it could and wish at the same time that it might. That sentence sort of folds on itself so many times. And of course, it's not over because I can continue writing it and extending it ad infinitum, because that's, I think, a dimension where we all live. And that's what I call the Irealis mood. There are many other forms of Irealis, which really we don't pay attention to in English particularly. So that's the best definition I can give you of what the Irealis is. It's your life looked at as the road never taken or the road that you could have taken. My contention, and I'll stop here, is that we all live in the Irealis dimension, and never, I think hardly anyone I know lives in the here and now present. That it does not really exist. We live in the past sometimes in the future, but we remember things that never even existed. That's where you start sort of digging into the Irealis.
I think that's such a beautiful concept. And also it seems like today we're supposed to be just kind of living in the present and everything is so speeded up and, you know, social media and this and that. But in fact, what this book does so beautifully is let us kind of linger on the ways in which the present is a very tenuous place. And we are always kind of looking back and looking at the future. And you talk about this also in relation to writers in the book, like Proust, and also cities, Rome, a little bit of Paris. But I wanted to find one of the, oops, sorry, I'm just gonna have a document here. When you talk about, you know, one of the Irealis mood moments is you're in Paris, having moved there from Egypt, and what you say is, but once in France, I soon realized that it was not the friendly and welcoming France I had dreamed of in Egypt. That particular France had been, after all, merely a myth that allowed us to live with the loss of Egypt. I think that this is the way you kind of calibrate. You're in one country thinking of a past and imagining a future. I mean, this is how, yeah, I mean, I wonder if it seems like so many paths in your life, you know, it's always out of Egypt with you.
It always goes back to Egypt, and it's not just a metaphor. I used to think that if you moved from one country to another country, you would forget who you were before. I used to think that, and I still do, that if I travel from one place to another place, especially when they're far from each other, I might forget many things that are part of my identity. And of course, I was totally mistaken. What happened is that in Egypt, I was longing to be in France. I couldn't wait to be in France. Egypt was never going to be my home. They made it's very clear to me that I was no longer welcome in Egypt, particularly because I was Jewish. So I was already sort of drifting to France while in Egypt. But I also knew, and that's the converse aspect of the whole thing, I knew that once in France, I would want to remember Egypt. And what would I remember once I was in Egypt, once I was in France? I was going to remember longing to be in Paris. So here I am in Paris, longing to be in Egypt so that I can think of being in the imaginary Paris. And there's a wonderful poem by Basho, I wish I could remember it, where he says, I'm in Kyoto, remembering some kind of flower, as I'm still in Kyoto. I'm translating it badly, but it's the idea that you're in Kyoto thinking of something that's typical of Kyoto while you're still in Kyoto, as if you're missing it. And I always think that we are always skidding away from what is given to us in day-to-day experience.
And when you talk in the essay about Cavafy's bed about Alexandria, you also talk about Alexandria itself. You say Alexandria was provisional in every sense of the word, the way truth is provisional, home is provisional, pleasure, and of course, love are provisional. There is no other way. I wanted to underline half this book.
Well, I think that because Alexandria was, I always like to compare it to St. Petersburg. It's not an accident that I do that, because these two are basically created cities. They are invented cities. They came because somebody decided that we're going to put a city here. It has a good port. Let's build those streets. And Alexandria was the first grid city ever conceived in mankind's history. So in a sense, it is an artificial city, and it knows it's artificial, the way St. Petersburg is always reminded that it is basically built on the bones of, I think, 500,000 people who built this city out of sludge. And you can imagine the tortures that they were put through. So there's always a sense that nothing is permanent here. It's always Alexandria was always borrowing the culture of Greece, the culture of the Middle East, the culture of Arabia, which was not Arabia at the time, but there was always borrowing. Nothing was autochthonous to Alexandria. So in many respects, makes sense that truth is provisional also. It's borrowed. Love is borrowed. It's not perpetual. Nothing lasts in Alexandria. And I'm here as an example of a person who's born in Alexandria, who considers himself still an Alexandrian, but of course is no longer an Alexandrian. So I'm both.
You're in between. You begin the book with a quotation from Pessoa, who says, "I am the gap between what I am and what I am not." So
that's right. What does that mean? I don't know what that means, but it makes perfect sense. I am just in between who I am and who I am not. What is that in between? We don't know. I always like the idea of intermezzo, because the intermezzo is between two courses. It's not a course, but it's just something in between. It doesn't really exist. It will go away.
The way that different cities, I mean, first of all, this book resonated with me a lot because I, like you, have had the great pleasure of spending a lot of time in 3 of the great cities of the world, which are New York, Rome, and Paris. And those are kind of my 3 main cities. And a person could do worse, right? I mean, and when you live with and engage with cities of that great, that much beauty and that much texture and that much history, or in the case of New York, as you say, it has you talk about New York as a city that has it has a city that held no loyalty to its past, which I thought was
true. It is so true that New York is fundamentally disloyal. You can see how easily a store is built on the remnants of another store. And this is true today because you walk by Madison Avenue, you see that there are vestiges of old stores that haven't been filled yet. But you also have a sense that a building doesn't last forever. I mean, you think of buildings in the old world, they're made to build and ostensibly to last forever. Whereas in New York, you just demolish it and you build another thing in its place. There is no sense of retention and therefore no sense of real loyalty. People have basically not destroyed brownstones, but they've taken down the stoops from brownstones, which really offends me. So they've changed the profile of the city. Why? Because you can rent an extra apartment that way. It makes sense if you own a brownstone and you want to make money. But as far as the city's look is, but then you think of Paris, it's the same thing. Paris, the old Paris, has completely been eviscerated and disappeared. We have now this kind of Baron Haussmann baron, which is Paris, it looks fabulous. We love the way it looks, but in its time, it was deplored.
And you have 2 essays in this collection about Rome and Freud. And Freud, of course, saw Rome as a kind of metaphor for the psyche, where there are all these layers kind of there, right, all at once to be excavated. And I think in the Freud's Shadow on Rome, you have one of, I think, the most beautiful descriptions of a city that I have spent many years loving and being driven crazy by, where you call it the eternal Rome, the eternal landfill, is nothing more than a hodgepodge of constantly reshuffled and refolded tenses, mostly the past tense, marginally the present, and heavily the conditional and subjunctive moods, all merging in a medley that linguists call Irealis Mood, that indescribable counterfactual time zone where we mortals spend most of our days with might have beens that haven't really happened, but aren't unreal for not happening and might still happen, though we hope and fear they both will and never happen. Could you talk a little bit about your engagement with Rome and what that city in particular has really meant to you and what it elicits in you?
Well, it elicits many contradictory and conflicting feelings. When I arrived from Egypt in Rome, we were given an apartment we were renting the apartment from one of my uncles. And I immediately hated Rome. And I went on hating it for about a year. And so what I would do in Rome, which I've written about in another essay, is that I would basically buy a book every week. I could only afford one book per week, and basically hide in the apartment, usually with the shutters drawn, so I wouldn't have to look outside, because I didn't like what I saw outside. I didn't like Roman. I didn't like the language that they speak in Rome. I didn't like anything about Rome. And in order to go and buy a book, I would have to go down to the old city, or the historic center, as it's called today. And I would basically walk enough to get to a bookstore. Eventually, those walks tarried, and they lasted a bit longer, and I explored the city more. And eventually I got to figure that this is an amazing city. And I realized this just before leaving Rome to come to New York. So part of during those 3 years that I was in Rome, all my vacations, all my free time was spent in Paris, because my father lived in Paris. So I wanted to move to Paris. Paris was not going to work out. It was, as a critic once said about me, I had a rendezvous manqué with Paris, which is fine. And I'm happy that it was manqué. But I go back to Rome. But I find that after about a month in Rome, I find that my patience runs short. And I can no longer stand the fact that these are, particularly Rome it's sometimes too antiquated for me, not modern enough, which is, I'm impatient with the slowness of things. And when they're speeded up, they're not good quality. When you go to a restaurant, if they serve you too fast, you know they use the microwave. So that sort of thing. So I become impatient. I want to come back to New York. I'm in New York, I want to be in Rome right away. That's the itinerary that I travel in. In other words, I don't belong in either one.
I can, but yet you do belong in both at the same time, however.
Yes, I think I do. And I love Italian, and I love speaking in Italian, and I love giving talks in Italian, because it brings out something else in me. I don't know what exactly, because I'm too focused on speaking in Italian to examine myself. But it's a wonderful experience, and they've been amazing to my books, I have to say. Italy, besides the United States and England, have been fantastic.
The essay, one of the essays in this book about Rome is very suggestive, and it's about an encounter you have on a bus with a man that which is a different life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, it was a very crowded bus. And I got on the bus, and there was some guy, a young guy behind me, and he was pushing into me. And I would say this was the first time I'd ever been held by a man. And I said, oh, I like this. What is going on? And of course, he was trying to move away from me, but he was holding me nonetheless. And I felt, because I over-examine everything, is he aware of what he's doing to me? Or am I the only one who's guilty of being aware of that? It's like when you are touching somebody's knee, your knee touches somebody else's knee at a table. You always don't want to pull yours away, because that might mean that you're too conscious. You leave it there, but then they might misinterpret the fact that you're leaving it there. You don't know. And basically that same evening, my mother had a guest for dinner who was a girl my age, and she probably was totally in love with me. I wasn't. And I can imagine her being naked in bed with me. And then I thought of him being naked in bed with me, and I got all confused. But for me, it was a sort of the source of an Irealis moment in Rome, where basically I didn't know which of the two did I like. Did I like both of them? Yes, I probably did. Did I do anything? Eventually I did with her. But there was a sense of, I was confused. And then I realized that this is exactly what Freud must have experienced when he went to Rome. He was going to Rome allegedly to look at the statue of Moses each time, because he wrote about that. But at the same time, he was very conscious of something by Leonardo. And he was also very taken by a painting by Leonardo, where he describes basically men, women, or women who look like men and men who look like women. And he was enthralled by that. And so I'm sure that he had an encounter with the same statue that I end up speaking with, imaginary, of course, with the statue in my recent visit to the museum, the Vatican Museum.
Which is of an Apollo.
Yes,
the
it's
lizard.
an Apollo, yes. He's killing a lizard. And And of course, I wanted to see the original one. We don't even know where the original is because it might be in Cleveland. We don't know. And there's all kind of fraud. But these are all imitations of a statue which no longer possibly exists, but it's one of the most beautiful statues. And they have one at the Villa Albani, and I wanted to go to Villa Albani. Finally, I made it into Villa Albani. And of course, I was disappointed.
Well, this is another thing. We build things up in our mind of imagining. He first goes to Greece, just stunned because he's kind of numb, right? It doesn't completely bowl him over, but that is such an experience of travel. And I think of you know, the shock of the real when you've been living in the imaginary for so long.
Well, I mean, Freud, of course, avoided going to Rome. He traveled all in Italy, all through Italy, went even to the south of Italy. So maybe had bypassed by train Rome, but never stopped in Rome until he forced himself to do it. And then he kept coming back to Rome all the time. He called it the Roman phobia, and he was fully aware of that. And he examined himself, and I think he even lied about his examination because there was something going on there that he didn't want to confront. And I'm not going to go into it now. So,
okay. Among the many and artists whose work you engage with in these essays, of course, we have Proust. And it seems to me that Proust is very much kind of the, I wouldn't say at the heart of this book, because so many authors are, but you're thinking about Proust over the years so deeply, and you're writing about Proust here in this collection. It seems to me that Proust and his sense of time and what you call the signature Proustian time, which is a kind of anticipation as opposed to a realization or a fulfillment or a, you know, consummation even, that seems to have really had affected you deeply. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and about this concept that the Proustian sentence is not meant to reveal truth in some ways, but to conceal it.
Well, it quarrels with truth. It seems to want to excavate truth. And that is in the Freud essay. Proust is trying to excavate, and he's so precise, and he sort of creates these sentences that go on forever and that give every indication of wanting to find what is going on in his heart, in the faces of other people. What do they want? What does he want from them? What is he expecting from life? All these things are being constantly, there's an archaeological dig in Proust, and that is the beauty of Proust. But at the same time, every time he's about to experience something that he's been anticipating, he basically finds a way to put it off. And I like the example of when finally, after Albertine rejected him in the most horrible manner, she comes to his house and is lying in bed with him. And he says, you know, do you want to tickle me? What a thing to say, but anyway. But he's, at the same time that it becomes together, bed. He says, can you give me a rain check? And the reason why he wants a rain check is because he has another assignation that same evening with another person, another woman, and she decides at the last minute not to show up. And now he's torn about calling Albertine, who's the first woman in this case, to tell her, yeah, you know, I'm free tonight. Why don't we spend some time? It is all, everything is so knotted up. Whereas in fact, you would think that he's trying to determine what is truth, and he comes up always with obstacles to the truth, partly so that he can go on either living, desiring, or maybe even writing. For him, they're both the same. Writing and desiring are the same thing. So if you put an end to a story, then you have nothing left. So you might as well continue writing it and finding other ways of also going to obstruct.
This is where I feel I need to ask you about the difference between longing and yearning, which is a passage you talk about in the Proust essay.
I think there is no difference, but someone who knew, you probably know him, big from Italian, told me there's a difference between yearning and longing. Yearning is when you long for something in the past. In other words, you have regrets or whatever, or remorse. There's two, I talk about the two. But he's also saying that longing, however, is when you want something in the future or in the very close future. So there are different economies, if you wish. I don't know that they're any different. It's just that there's a bit of sorrow in less and probably more desire in longing.
Here I should point out that these essays are very deep and ruminative, but they're not at all gloomy, and they're very lively while you kind of play with these concepts in a not light in a substance way, but with a light touch, with a sprezzatura that I think is really
well, because I do like, sometimes I will have this kind of humor embedded in the essays because I like humor and I like to look at the funny aspect of things, and I don't take myself seriously, which is probably one of the reasons why people feel, yeah, I can understand what he's doing. But on the other hand, I do take art seriously, and any conversation about art is, for me, important. I discover things about what I think about art only when I write about art or about another. But then what I do, which is terrible for if you're a critic, and even worse if you're a teacher, and I am both, is that I find that I intentionally misread those writers and the composers and the movie directors. I misread everything in order to read something that makes sense to me, that basically reveals something to me. And I think that a lot of people have done the same thing with my books. In other words, they read Call Me By Your Name and they decide that it's telling their story. If you could sort of tweak this and tweak that, they would find their own identity there. And I think that this is how we approach everything. We misinterpret, not intentionally, but because we have to. Otherwise, there's no point in interpreting anything.
It's a way of connecting to the yeah. work, and to see yourself reflected in it. But I mean, I don't see that these of the authors and the film directors like Rohmer, Albert T. But I mean, is that a misreading or is that just your reading?
Well, let me give you an example. There's a wonderful moment in which Swann in Proust is going to kiss Odette. And as he's about to kiss her, because she's kind of falling in his arms, he says, oh, he's holding her face away because he wants to consummate not the kiss, but he wants to consummate the abeyance, the awaiting for that kiss that he's been sort of mulling and cradling for minutes beforehand. Now it's going to happen. And he wants the person who was longing for that kiss to be present as he's about to kiss Odette, her name is. And then as he's kissing her, he's saying, oh, I'm by to an Odette that had been kissed before. She will never be unkissed before. Now, this is Proust analyzing the situation. This is typical Proust. That is basically the way everything moves in Proust. You have your moment, you have your cake, and before you eat it, you ruin the moment by bringing in the anticipation for the cake. And then, of course, by saying, I will remember this cake, but it will never be the same cake because I've had it for the first time here. You're ruining the moment. But there's a wonderful moment when when Marcel, the kid, is passing by the house of Swann, and he says, God, I wish I could be up there and be one of them and become an habitué in their house. Guess what? He gets invited, and he gets invited many times so that he becomes a normal guest in their house constantly. And he looks out the window at people coming in, and he waves at them, and they wait, oh, he must be a person living in this apartment. I added, because Proust never does, at least I don't remember Proust doing that, and that's where I misread Proust, that Marcel is also thinking of the day when he will be walking down the street, having been rejected by the girl who lives with the Swanns, and that he will feel now back to where he was before he had been admitted. So there are three moves. Proust only talks about two. I added the third one. And so that is what you call misreading. But I think it makes perfect sense to me. So I make Proust more Irrealis than he actually is.
How do you have such thoughtful and slow, not slow, but in New York, which is so fast? I mean, it seems to me what I love about these essays is they kind of stop and pause and time and the way we live our present lives when it's just so difficult to do that. Was it a force of will, or do you just tune a lot of things out?
Unfortunately, I tune a lot of things out, but I'm not a hermit. I mean, you see this room, yes, it makes you think that I'm a hermit, but I'm really not. I'm stuck at home because you can't go anywhere and you can't see any of that stuff. But basically, I'm also on this at the same time that I'm this very internal human being. I'm very social. And I think that Proust is a good example. He was himself very, very social and at the same time totally reclusive. And so the social does not interfere. Actually, it sort of it distracts you a bit because you need to be distracted. But in the social, you also borrow many things. You see things that might sort of define what you're working on.
In the essays on Rohmer, Éric Rohmer's films in the book, what I want to ask you about Rohmer and why those works resonate. But you talk about going to see these films at a time in your life when you're, finishing grad school and don't know what you're doing, and New York is New York. And it's not just let me analyze Rohmer, it's let me tell you about when I first encountered Rohmer and what he meant to me then, which is a particular kind of intellectual dialogue, basically.
I think that's what I like to do. And I think that more critics should have the courage to do that, is to explain why a particular book or why a particular work of art speaks to you. It doesn't speak abstractly to you. It speaks to you as a human being because you've experienced it biographically, not just intellectual part, that you have to be extremely tactful. You don't want to overplay it, but it's there. And for me, watching Rohmer's film was a way of saying, my God, why am I not having conversations like the ones that they have in the cafes in France? Of course, the real France is totally different. We know that. But I longed for that kind of world where things are slowed down and analyzed and discussed over wine, over coffee, over whatever. And there was something that I was missing in New York. And I was longing for it. And I found it in Rohmer. But then I also found many other things in Rohmer that made sense to me. I like the fact that in Rohmer, everything ultimately makes sense, has a place. There's a form that allows for accidents, chaos even to occur, and then it's finally resolved. Not in a way official, but it is resolved because in every contrary situation that Rohmer examines, there is some sort of concord that is about to be revealed. And that, for me, to put it very generally, is basically the form of classicism, which I think still belongs in France, though it's trying to be everything that it's not. But there's a fundamental abiding with rules, with a search for harmony, for order, for symmetry, and for, of course, when you have all these things, you have a certain kind of luminosity that is expressed. And I love that about Rohmer, but that's just the surface.
Within the universe of the films, at least. But one of the things that you also talk about in the essays is just that dialogue, that kind of conversation, that kind of, especially in My Night at Maud's, where it's a kind of, we can talk about what it's about, but there's a lot of talking.
Well,
right?
it's also very well written talk. Nobody speaks that way in real life, but who cares about real life? That's what I'm also trying to say. Real life is just, as I say somewhere else in the book, it's just stuff. It has to be organized. It has to be reasoned. It has to be stylized. Those are all terms that I think are very important. Yes, there is conversation happening. And guess what? The man and the woman, he's sitting on her bed wearing his double-breasted suit. She is in bed, practically naked. And she's trying to seduce him. And he's saying, I'm a good Catholic, I can't do this. But they're talking about in a very generic manner and sort of not exactly clear, but it's there. They're talking about sex and desire as they're in bed together, but not really doing anything that desire would mandate for them to do. So they're examining desire and their history of love while they're in bed together, but they're not going to have sex, which is a totally unusual situation. But it takes you back to this Irealis moment where conversation has trumped desire, or at least put it on hold because something else is about to occur. And in fact, Jean-Louis, the man in wearing the double-breasted suit, will leave her apartment and meet in the street the woman that he knows, he hasn't spoken to her yet, but he knows he's going to marry her. And he does marry her. And then he finds out that she was the reason why Maud, the woman who was in bed naked, got a divorce from her husband.
And it all ties up in that way.
Totally ties up.
We can cross-brand and say you can watch all these on the Criterion channel, which is one of the great things.
Yes, they have them. They do have them. That's true.
Is there the book at now, or is there a passage? I mean, the essays here are range from many different cities and authors.
Well, I might read maybe a paragraph, because I don't want to read the usual paragraph that I always read, but it's about Beethoven, and in the chapter where I discuss Beethoven basically writing, composing as if it were a souffle. Of course, I don't really mean that, but here I'm going to read it, okay? And I'm probably reminded of Beethoven's most beautiful piece of music, his Song of Thanksgiving, composed after a close bout with sickness and death. The Song of Thanksgiving is a handful of notes, plus a sustained, overextended hymn in the Lydian mode, which the composer loves and doesn't wish to see end, because he likes repeating questions and deferring answers, because all answers are easy, because it's not answers or clarity or even ambiguity that Beethoven wants. What he's after is deferral and distended time, a grace period that never expires and that is all cadence, that staves off the scariest thing awaiting next door, called death. Beethoven will keep repeating and extending the process until it is reduced to its barest elements and he's left with 5 notes, 3 notes, 1 note, no breath. The fullness of the absence after the final note is the whole point, and he's fearless in making us hear it. And maybe all art strives for just that, life without death. The greatest art, Beethoven's soundless last note, Joyce's Snow, the Proustian sentence that enacts the paradox of times, peers squarely into the unfathomable, the mystery of not being there to know we're already absent.
I'm so glad you chose that passage. It's a beautiful paragraph.
Thank you.
Well, you were going to say something and I interrupted you.
No, I think that it's the way I say it is that basically when we think about time, we're always thinking about, and we're not always conscious of it, we're thinking about not being on this planet. This is the thing that we consider the most, and we don't want to face it, which I don't blame. Nobody should think about death if they can avoid it. But here's the thing is that basically Beethoven and Proust and Joyce, they're all writing and composing in a way that basically pushes the end out of the picture. It's no longer just the future. It's not the past. It's basically this unreal dimension that ultimately tries to defeat the thing that we fear the most, which is death. And I think that Beethoven died not much longer after composing this. It's from the quartet, the A minor quartet, which is probably the most beautiful thing ever composed on the face of this planet. But there it is. It's just the specter of death is staring at you, and you don't want to deal with it. You want to push it away. You want to keep writing. I need to keep writing, says Proust. And I think that all great writers, the greatest writers, once they discovered their form, they can't stop writing in it. They will die with almost their pen in their hand. Bach will die, we think, with his pen in his hand. This is how it is. In other words, a writer who discovers her form will keep on going forever if they could. There's no stopping them.
That is art. That is what they should be doing.
Well, some should not, let's face it too. But we're not going to name names.
All right. Andre, thank you. This is fantastic. I'm going to read out some questions from the audience.
Sure.
The viewership. What do we call everyone on Zoom now? There's a question from Tiffany Babb, who asks, the imagining of these dreamed spaces, cities seems similar to the deliberate misreading of texts that you mentioned when it comes to what we read onto reality. Can you speak to the tensions between the imagined and the quote unquote real, and the ways the imagined misread can survive beyond experience with the real?
What is the real that we're talking about? Is it the real text or reality as we live it?
I guess you should interpret this as you could misread this as you would like.
Okay. I think that misreading is a form of artistic production. I will believe that. I think that Cavafy, when he looks at Cavafy used to make love in a particular apartment with his lover. Then he comes back many years later and he sees the apartment has become a business office. The bed is gone. The band of sunlight that used to cross the bed has disappeared. And he's looking at it and he said, well, one day my lover left and never came back. But my interpretation of this is that, but Cavafy never says this, but I make him say it, is that he knew, even as he was making love to his lover, that one day he would come back, find the apartment turned into a business office, and he would, at that point, either write a poem or remember. In other words, he was already anticipating remembering this apartment as it used to be once upon a time. And that's the Irealis mood. That's how I misread things. In other words, I give them an extra dimension, which they may not have had. But once, that's how I take possession of them. And I think any critic worth anything is after taking possession of the work that he's criticizing or is examining. You want to possess it. It's like Montaigne, who can't stop himself from quoting everybody can quote, because that's his way of owning Cicero and of owning Plutarch and owning everything else.
We have another question from Doña Alisa, who asks, you discussed yearning for X while at Y, while you are in X anyways. Can you elaborate on a city, thing, place, someone whom you have yearned for, although you were already there next to the person, perhaps?
Yes, of course. This happens to us all the time, and not to me only, but, and I suppose it's not just me that the question is addressed to, is that we yearn for X while we have X, because what we've done is we've sort of wedged in a space between us and X, us and the city, us and the person, us and the food. Okay, we've put something in between, and it was anticipation or anticipated remembrance or many other dimensions. In other words, we've sort of brought a different dimension of time into an experience that most people say, you know, tonight I'm going to have lasagna, I'm going to enjoy lasagna, and I will digest it, and then I will go to sleep and I'll be a happy person. That is not what I'm after. And I don't think most of us know how to do that, though we claim that we do. We all claim to be in the here and now because we're solid people. That would put all shrinks out of business if we all believed that.
Now aware of the potent existence of the Irealis moods, asks Eleanor Zhang, how do you think they should manifest in the habits of art making?
Can you read that question again?
Yes. I think the question is basically, how should Irealis moods manifest in the habits of art making?
I mean, the way I like to say it is that the piece of art that you're making is already inhabited by the Irealis mood. What we turn to art, not just to sell art or to get it published. We turn to art because art is the expression or the attempt to resolve what it is that we're trying to sort in ourselves, and especially about time, because we're discussing time. The work of art is the answer itself, but it's not a concluding answer, it's a provisional answer. And that's why artists will return time and time and time again to paint the same thing, to compose the same kind of music, to write the same exact song in different keys.
Cézanne and his many apples.
Thank you. Yes, that's what it is. Or as I like to say, Monet and his 30 cathedrals. Why is he so obsessed with a cathedral? We say he's obsessed. Okay, that's not the reason.
Natasha Butalia asks, do you think a work can therefore never be misread? Excuse me, do you think a work can therefore never not be misread?
I think if you want to make sense of a work of art, if you want to absorb it because it has spoken to you and only to you, you have to misread it. If you don't misread it, then you're being objective. And yes, I think that some great critics have been very, very objective. But what you don't see is that they bring also their self. How is it that they reacted in their gut? They won't tell you because that's what criticism does. It's not always revealing what the biographical impact has been. It pretends that biographical impact has never occurred, but it's always there. What happens is that we find other ways of expressing our reaction to a work of art. But meanwhile, it has struck us in a very, very private place, which is filled with chaos and filled with misunderstanding. So how many times have you read a novel and said, I know what was going on in this novel. I know why this character felt this way, and yet I cannot prove it. But you know. Well, if you're a critic worth your salt, you should basically say, how is it that you know what it is that you feel is happening in the novel and why? And basically from that personal reaction, extrapolate something that everybody else will share. So we have to misread.
Question from Pascal Niehoff. I'm wondering if the whole notion of infinite possibilities is a particularly male thing. The idea of being in bed with someone and talking about sex and not having it seems inconceivable to me. Maybe this is because women are more grounded in reality, because we are typically saddled with more mundane everyday responsibilities than men. Do men imagine all the possibilities because they have more options? Just a thought.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that men and women are, thank God, they're very different in many, many ways. But I don't think that there's a masculine way of behaving vis-a-vis desire and a feminine way of desiring. There are different manifestations. I will agree with that. And sometimes I'd say it's a good thing that we are different. But on the other hand, I don't think that there's a masculine approach to desire and a feminine approach to desire, particularly if you're going to explain to me that one is grounded and the other one is basically fugitive and not really grounded, anchorless. I don't know that that's true. I think men have women inside of them, just as women have men inside of them. I meant that figuratively, of course. In other words, there's a masculine identity that's just masculine, does not exist.
I think that Pascal now writes to say she wasn't necessarily just referring to she wasn't referring to desire, but to writing or imagination. I mean, I think if women are busy, holding up the roof of the house and don't have time to imagine all the infinite possibilities of this and that,
Well, there's one thing I can say is that I've written my dissertation on a woman writer. I always teach more women writers than men writers. So that means that I understand women better than most men who only teach masculine books. I don't think that these distinctions take us very far, and they're inaccurate. They're easy, and you can write an article about that, but I don't think you can assume that about people, because people are, somebody could be extremely masculine and then turn to be extremely feminine the next day.
Which woman did you write about, your thesis?
Oh, Madame de Lafayette, which I still consider the best novel ever written.
Oh, nice. Unless there are other questions, I wonder if there's anything else you want to add about this book and what you hope readers will take away from it, and what how it transformed you also. I mean, writing a book, you begin as one person and end as another. Tell us,
It's true.
Yeah.
And I think that if there's a takeaway, and I don't know that there is one, but if there's any contribution, I want people to basically leave this particular conversation we just had, Rachel, and feel that, yeah, I understand what Irealis is. I live there. That's my address. I've done more Irealis desiring and thinking than I've ever been able to consider. And partly is because I think an author always brings something to the table that is not new, that you're totally familiar with. You just haven't really considered it deeply enough. And I want people to examine themselves and say, yes, this is an Irealis moment. The people who are going to go out and maybe have a drink or sit outside somewhere with a friend and have a coffee, they could and they should say, we're going to have an Irealis moment, because this is how we live our lives, mostly in a dimension that doesn't really exist in time.
And now we're doing a lot of longing and yearning.
Oh, please, now especially.
We can all be together.
Now that time has stopped entirely,
right.
We're on hold.
The book still holds up. So
thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much.
It was great to talk to you, and I encourage all of you to read this beautiful book. And maybe I don't know if Maris has more to add. But,
just please buy the book. Thank you for a lovely conversation and for being a wonderful audience, and have a lovely night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. And thank you, Rachel, wherever you are.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to.
We have to meet at some point, again.
I will look forward to that in the future.
You long for it too. Long for it. Yes. Stay well. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you all for